Welcome to QI Connect, our fifth and final session for 2020. Can you believe it? This is our 63rd session since we began. So I'm Ruth Glassborough, Director of Improvement at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and I'm your chair for today. QI Connect provides an opportunity for colleagues across health and social care and beyond to learn from international leaders in the fields of improvement, innovation and integration. So welcome to QI Connect. Next slide, please. So this is our second session it's actually our third session now in Microsoft Teams live events. And I'm going to pass you over to Jess to tell you how it works and how to use the question and answer function to submit your questions for our speaker today, Suzie Bailey. Jess, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of housekeeping slides for today. So you won't be able to use your mic or camera in a live event, but you'll be able to see and hear the presenters. At present, it's not possible to interact with attendees via chat, but you can upvote by liking any submitted questions you'd particularly like to see put to the speaker in the Q&A section, and I'll just come to how the Q&A function works in a second. So please use that function to submit your questions for the speaker. These will need to be moderated, so it may take a minute or two for your question to show up in the live chat. The session will be recorded, and by taking part you consent to this, and a recording of the session and resources covered will be made available following the session date. So the Q&A function, if you look at the top right hand of your screen, it's the icon, it looks like a speech bubble with a question mark in it, and that's where you submit your questions. So you put them in via the text box in My Questions, and any submitted questions will show up there. They will then show up in the featured panel once they've been approved. We have a moderation team for all the questions, so it may take a wee minute or two for your question to show up there. You can also like your favourite questions. It makes them appear higher up in Ruth's Q&A box, so that she can put them to Suzie at the end, the most popular questions. And a summary of any resources covered will be made available along with the recording after this session. So I'll just hand you back over to Ruth.
Thank you, Jess. So as well as staff across health and care services in Scotland, we now have over 1,300 organisations linking in, and this includes 89 universities and colleges. Next slide, please. So some of these organisations are based in other countries, and we now have 65 countries represented in our QI Connect community. Due to time differences, many of them will be watching this via the recording. So for those of you who are joining in person from around the world today, please do feel to flag that when asking a question where you're joining us from. It would be lovely to hear that. Next slide, please. Delivering QI Connect is very much a team effort, and what an amazing team it is. And also a special thank you to NHS Scotland's National Video Conferencing Service, who have provided us with excellent support this year in the transition from BT WebEx to Microsoft Teams live events. Please remember to tweet as you learn and use the QI Connect hashtag and tag in @QIConnectQI. And if you're not already following us on Twitter, please do give us a follow. So I am delighted today to introduce our guest speaker, Suzie Bailey. Suzie is the Director of Leadership and Organisational Development at the King's Fund. She is a long-term and passionate advocate of the value of QI in healthcare and the need for effective leadership. And her previous roles include leading the creation of the Sheffield Microsoft Coaching Academy, or the Sheffield Microsystem even Coaching Academy, in partnership with the Dartmouth Institute. And she was also Director of Leadership and Quality Improvement at NHS Improvement. She is a Health Foundation Generation Q Fellow, which is where I first had the privilege of meeting her. And we are really fortunate today to have her presenting. So without further ado, Suzie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that very kind introduction. Hello to you all, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And importantly, what I'd like to do is thank you for everything that you and your teams are doing during this most unprecedented year addressing COVID, and particularly how you're looking after each other as you do that. I'm really sorry that I can't see your faces and that I'm looking into the screen, and that this isn't more of a discussion, but hopefully as we open up for questions, there will be the opportunity for it to feel a bit more like a discussion. My hope is that during this session, you take the time to reflect on what you've learnt during 2020 and think about how that will affect your leadership in 2021. What kind of leader do you want to be in 2021? The term detox is really about abstaining from or getting rid of toxins. And so what I want you to think about as I'm speaking is, what are the things that you want to get rid of? What are the kind of leadership behaviours that you may have seen in 2020 that you really think need to be addressed? But also, when people detox, it's also about nurturing their body. So I also want you to think about, what are the things that you've seen that have worked really well in 2020, and what do you want to do more of as we move into the new year? Next. But firstly, I want to take you back to the 8th of April 2020, which in the UK was only a few weeks after we were in a national lockdown. And the 8th of April saw the highest death toll in the first wave of COVID in the UK. 1,445 COVID-related deaths happened on that day. Next. This is a picture of Donald and Doreen on their engagement trip to London. Donald and Doreen are my father and mother-in-law, and Donald Crowther died on 8th of April, that day with the highest death toll from the first wave. He first experienced symptoms on the Thursday. On the Saturday, he was taken by ambulance to the local District General Hospital in Huddersfield, and by Wednesday morning he had died. He had an underlying health condition. He had diabetes, and he was 84. No one was allowed to attend his funeral because of the restrictions in the locality at that time. He was a really lovely man, proud of being from Yorkshire, a very dear father-in-law to me. I'd first met him when I was 19, and he was a great granddad to my son. We really miss him, as you can tell from my voice. Now, as I talk to you today, over 56,000 people have now died in the UK this year as a result of COVID, as well as all of the thousands and thousands of people who have been affected by it. But behind the statistics are our friends, family, colleagues and neighbours. Next. So I think we know that the pandemic has impacted on everybody, and this is a photo taken from the International Space Station. Everyone's experience of COVID is different. Everyone on this call has had their own story, but everyone has been affected: family, friends, neighbours, communities, teams. And as a result, that means our leadership has been affected. And so what I'm really asking you to reflect on is, what are the things that you've seen in your leadership during 2020, and what are the things that you want to hold on to be an even better leader as we move into the new year of 2021? How do we harness the learning of these stories and the rich data that those stories bring for how care can be improved? And importantly, how do we work with the power that lies within our communities for that improvement? Next. The pandemic has also exposed underlying inequalities in our society. And as Sir Michael Marmot has highlighted, there is an urgency to tackle the social causes of those health inequalities. So as we reflect today on our leadership in health and care, I want us to think about what more we can do in collaboration with others, including importantly the voluntary and community sector, to to help address those inequalities. What is our leadership truly in the service of? So equity is a significant theme for the experience of leaders in 2020 and for the learning that we can take into 2021. Next. The horrific murder of George Floyd reignited a global social movement for racial justice. As leaders in health and care, we need to work together to make this a reality. And this photograph is taken very close to where I work in central London. This is a picture taken on Oxford Street. I think there will have been difficult conversations in your teams and your organisations about how we respond to this, just as there have been in mine at the King's Fund. But these conversations have also been hopeful about the changes we want to see, but they need to be converted into action. Anti-racism is an urgent call to action for all of us. We need to stand against all forms of oppression in the way that we lead in health and care. We need to be better allies, connecting, as Prerna Issar, who's our Chief People Officer in England, as she says, connect to your inner activist. Next slide, please. But one of the powerful things we have seen is kindness and compassion in our local communities in what has been a really tough year. Across the 4 nations of the UK and globally, there have been amazing stories of people helping people, of doing what feels right to help someone in need. So I'm really interested as a leader in how we help to ensure that the power in our communities is harnessed and that the good that is being done in our communities can be amplified long after the pandemic. Next. Another experience in 2020 that I think is important to note is the much greater appreciation and understanding of the roles of key workers of all types. And importantly, there's also been a greater appreciation of those who work in social care, which I think has been long overdue. But also others that are essential to keeping the country going, including teachers and nursery workers, supermarket workers, transport, utilities, communications, delivery. There are so many more. But what we also need to appreciate is that research, including that by the RSA, shows that many of these key workers are facing the worst of the economic turmoil that's been created by the pandemic. So as we move into 2021, we need to think about how we support those key workers in our local communities. Next, please. I live in Sheffield, in Yorkshire, in the United Kingdom, and last year the data showed that 27% of children in the city where I live were living in poverty, so before the pandemic. One of the issues that has come to prominence is that of food poverty, and there are over 2,000 food banks currently in the UK. A recent House of Lords report highlighted the vital role that these food banks are playing. However, they emphasise that these exist to plug a hole in our existing social security system. Modelling that was commissioned by the Trussell Trust, who was involved in these food banks, on the levels of need anticipate a significant rise in the levels of destitution in the UK. And they've suggested that this could increase by about 61% of the kind of need for emergency food parcels in the last quarter of this year compared to the previous year. Next. In Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, the free school meals were extended to eligible children during the school holidays. This was not the situation in England, where I live and where my son goes to school. And we're fortunate that he doesn't need to have those free school meals. But in England, the actions of Marcus Rashford, who is now a 23-year-old international football player who plays for Manchester United in England, he showed the power of kindness. He used his agency and his influence and shared his personal story of experiencing poverty and receiving free school meals as he grew up. And by sharing that story, he ignited kindness and compassion in others. And the response across the country was incredible. From individuals and businesses, people already struggling and affected themselves by the pandemic, but through their generosity, they made amazing offers to local families in need. And Marcus also managed to help the government change its mind and make the necessary change. So he not only impacted on local communities, but he actually managed to influence policy and government as well. Kindness and leadership can come from anywhere, and I was really inspired by what Marcus Rashford did just very recently. And as this makeshift sign put up in the place where he comes from in Manchester says, this was a humanity united. And so as we think about our leadership going into 2021, I really want us to hold on to that message. Next slide, please. So what did we hear from leaders in Wave 1? Well, I think it's really important to say that all the leadership stories are different, and clearly the health and social care landscape, both in the UK and internationally, is complex, and so it's resistant to crude generalisation. However, we did hear from leaders from work that we were doing in the King's Fund. We developed some resources on our website around leading through COVID, some bite-sized resources to try and support leaders. And what we were getting in terms of feedback was that leaders were describing a sense of renewed purpose in their work during this year, despite all the challenges, and that a sense that transformational change had been shown to be possible and be shown to be possible at speed. But leaders were experiencing a whole range of emotions during this time. So some of them were feeling overwhelmed, some of them expressed feeling exhilarated by the work they were doing, some of them felt stood down, some of them felt quite withdrawn and far from the front line, but many of them described feeling exhausted. And that was just in the first 3 months of the pandemic, and clearly we've experienced much more. And then in terms of as we look beyond COVID, there was a kind of a range of perspectives from people, from those desperate to get back to business as usual, so talking about normal, many talking about the new normal, what would that look like, and many questioning whether it was time for a fundamental reimagining of the assumptions on which our current systems are based. Next, please. Many leaders, me included, are talking to you behind this laptop, found themselves leading teams virtually for the first time, and what a challenge that has been. Needing to try and recreate connections through the screen, the trust and energy of the past, trying to manage performance and have difficult conversations online. My own experience has included how my team have needed to adapt by developing their skills. We've moved from doing what was 100% face-to-face leadership development work to being now all virtual. And it's been really important to kind of learn as we've been doing and forgive each other for some of the mistakes that happen as you're doing that learning. So I'm really interested as we move into 2021 around what more we can do to support each other to improve this hybrid way of working, because clearly working virtually is here to stay. So how do we do that in a way that is supportive, and how do we continue to offer flexibility where that's possible to our staff? And I can see the slides are just coming back up. So to the next slide, please. You never really know what people are dealing with, even those people close to you in your team, what things they might be battling. But what's really important in our leadership is our ability to be kind and compassionate. One of the key things that we heard from leaders was how to manage their own mental health and well-being during the difficult times that we've faced, and then also how to obviously address the health and well-being of others. Leaders were open in describing increased anxiety, that they were dealing with the uncertainty, and how to sustain their resilience. Annie Laverty, who's a colleague of many of us on this call from Northumbria Foundation Trust, is also reminding us of the importance not to trust historic data on staff well-being, and the importance of tapping into how your staff are on a regular basis. They've done some really interesting work in Northumbria, setting up a safe and effective way of how to help staff raise concerns, raise issues, provide information to staff and to share their feelings. And this is work that would be worth you having a look at. It's called Corona Voice. And for leaders during this year, there's been a difficult balance to strike between creating a sense of optimism and hope, whilst at the same time acknowledging that staff and teams are going through a wide range of responses, just as they have been from the start of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So, if COVID-19 is the biggest challenge that we have faced in living memory, it's important that we take the learning from this experience. And this slide refers to a piece of work that we did at the King's Fund, that the references on the slides there, Road to Renewal. And it's really important that we take the learning from the experience, whether from the rapid progress achieved in digitising and transforming service delivery, the extraordinary contributions of millions of staff and volunteers, or from the shortcomings and inequalities that have been brought sharply into focus, as I was speaking about earlier. But what I've chosen to focus on today, particularly from a perspective of leadership, is putting our people centre stage. And if I can have the next slide, please, which is the global workforce slide. We are facing a global workforce crisis, and we're also facing this workforce crisis in the UK. Last year, we published a report, Closing the Gap, with colleagues from the Health Foundation and the Nuffield, which showed the scale of the issue in England and that this needs sustained action for at least a decade in order to start to close that gap, both in terms of the need to get the right supply of health and care staff, so the supply, but also to develop the support and leadership that retains staff and makes them want to stay in the service. Next slide, please. So during this summer, it's been a real privilege to work with Professor Michael West and Ethan Williams, my colleagues at the King's Fund, and to work with nurses and midwives across the UK. And I'd like to say a particular thank you to colleagues in Scotland for the insights they gave us. The purpose of this slide is really to just say that the data we have on our workforce was stark before the pandemic. And that, combined with the learning that we've done during 2020, gives us really important data on which to work as leaders. We cannot ignore the health and well-being of our staff, and action is required at every level. So for everybody on this call, one of the things that I would urge you to do when thinking about your leadership for 2021 is how much more you can do with your colleagues to help address the health and well-being of our staff right across the service. Next slide, please. I talked earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement, and again, this is data that we published this year at the King's Fund. It's research we conducted, which includes powerful experiences of staff in England. And to be honest, this was really hard to listen to for both the researchers that were doing this work. You can see this work on our website and you can hear the voices of some of the people that have contributed. My question to you is, what data are you paying attention to as you lead in wherever you are, either in the UK or beyond? Next slide, please. So I hope I've conveyed, and I hope I've looked at you enough through this camera to say that there is so much learning for us to work with. It's been a really challenging year, but the learning can be a force for good. A positive has been the much greater emphasis on the health and well-being of our people. But fundamentally, I think we need to tackle some of the underlying causes of stress and burnout that our staff have been experiencing, and particularly what that has shown up during the pandemic. Next slide, please. We're part of a wider leadership community, many of the people who are on this call today, and there's some great work underway in the UK. This slide just reflects some of it. And in Scotland, for example, you've particularly been leading the way in collective leadership. So I think as tough as the year has been, it's been great to be part of a much wider community. It's a real sense that we're in this together. And so I think we need to create, as leaders, we need to create many more opportunities to network and to learn from each other. And the QI Connect programme is clearly one of those. And the work that is happening across the UK really brings great strength to the work that I lead at the King's Fund and my colleagues lead. And I'm really grateful to colleagues in Scotland for their generosity in sharing their experiences and the learning from their work. Next slide, please. If this video works, you're about to hear from Fatima Khan Shah, who lives and works in West Yorkshire. It's just a couple of minutes.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm exhausted. We are working and dealing with some of the most challenging environments that we could not have even imagined. And it's required me to work differently, to adapt, to deal with uncertainty. And I think one of the other things that I've really learned during this time was something that I never used to prioritise before, but actually has really made me think about differently now, and that is self-care. So one of my most inspirational role models used to say to me that even superheroes need the time to put their capes in the wash, and I used to laugh about it, but actually I felt quite tired during this time. My resilience diminished, I lacked confidence, things seemed overwhelming, And that was not a result of my inability to do my job or the fact that I wasn't, you know, a good leader. It was because I was tired. And actually, that importance of self-care, taking time out from that role, is not me being a slacker. It's me investing in doing my job properly. So going offline, going analog, taking time out from Twitter, which for me has been really hard, and focusing on the people that nourish me, like my family, like my children, is just as important as the day job. And my one bit of wisdom would be, have a time and a place for things like social media and online platforms, but also a time and a place to invest in yourself, in your own development, in your own leadership, to believe in yourself and to continue to do what you are doing, which is an amazing job.
So I don't think I could have said it better than Fatima, and I'm very grateful to her for the work that she does in her locality, but also she works with us at the King's Fund, and that was one of the contributions that she made to our Leading Through COVID resources. So we're now going to focus just in the last few minutes before we open up for questions on looking ahead to 2021. So just some reflections from me. Next slide, please. So some of the questions that I'd like you to, next slide, please, that I'd like you to ask yourself as you think about your leadership is, why do you do the job that you do? What really matters to you? And do you enjoy your work? And if you don't, what do you think you could do in 2021 to make changes to that? And really importantly, as leaders, we need feedback. So what is it like to work with you? Have you asked your team recently what that's like? So as well as the data from the experience of 2020 that I've just been talking about, could you ask yourself those questions so that you can think about what your leadership will look like in 2021? Could we move to the next slide, please, which is self-care? So as Fatima said, we need to take time to take care of ourselves. It's something that I've certainly learned this year. It's okay not to be okay. The importance of rest, of exercise, on which I have to say I've mainly failed, and of taking time off all help us to be able to be better leaders. We have to be able to look after ourselves if we're to look after others. And I'm also very grateful to my colleagues and to friends and family for being there when I've needed them. As we've all been on, I think what's been described this year as a corona coaster of emotions. Next slide, please. As we think about what our work is as leaders, I would argue that the real work of leaders is on culture. Every interaction, every day affects the culture in which we work, and therefore as leaders, we have an important role in helping create the right culture and environment in which our staff can flourish and in which they can do their very best work. So I'd like to ask you, what is your team culture? Could you describe it? And what changes might you want to make in 2021 for the better? Next slide, please. This slide is contained within our report on the courage of compassion, which is the work I was referring to around nurses and midwives, but it really applies regardless of what role you have in health and care. And it's a framework that we used in order to kind of bring together our recommendations, but really focus people on the fact that at work, people have three core needs: autonomy, belonging, and contribution. And as leaders, I think our role is very much to create the environment in which all of those core needs are met. Next slide, please. So thinking about your leadership beyond COVID, what can you nurture in yourself and others in order to have greater impact? Verena Issar earlier today talking at one of our conferences, she's the Chief People Officer in England that I mentioned. She talked about the importance of having a vision as a leader that makes something that you're really passionate about making better. So what is it that your vision is for 2021? Next slide, please. I think leaders need to create some reflective space, time to stand back. And given the pressure that we've been under this year, some of that reflective space has been very hard to create. I think we need to involve others, ask them what they think and truly listen so that we can take that into account and make changes for the better. Next slide, please. Everyone on this call will have seen amazing examples of teamwork and teaming during the pandemic, but we've also heard very contrasting stories from people who've been redeployed at speed with little support, people feeling burnt out and let down. And those are also the stories that we need to pay attention to. We all have a responsibility to contribute and develop healthy workplace environments. So finding the time, even in busy schedules, to ask each other how you are and take the time to really find out what matters to our team colleagues. We have to practice teamwork. It doesn't just come naturally. And I was interested in the comment from one of my own team members this week at the King's Fund who commented on how much better we've got to know each other during the pandemic, which seems incredible that it took the pandemic for us to really take the time to listen to each other. Next slide, please. I think we also have a duty to focus more on collaboration and nurturing relationships. It's really easy to say and much harder to find the time to do. But what we have learned from the areas that have responded well to the pandemic and made the most progress is that was building on developed, trusted relationships locally. And so as leaders, I would like to argue that we need to spend more time paying attention to our relational work. Next slide, please. As I've described, and as many of you will know, there have been some incredible innovations across the globe during this time, despite the pressure. And as leaders, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to create that culture for innovation every day. We can help support our staff by developing their capability and capacity, but we need to create an effective learning environment and a system so that innovation and learning is part of everyday business. Next slide, please. I'm just coming to the end, a couple more slides. So we're very fortunate working in health and care that in many ways we're surrounded by kindness all the time, but we also experience incivility and things that are unkind. But despite everything that 2020 has thrown at us, and there are still a few weeks of it left, the power of human kindness, I think, has been ever evident. And I've also had the privilege of working with colleagues across the UK, in the US and in Europe this year. And there seems to be a really growing movement for the role that kindness plays in how we lead in health and care. Next slide, please. Now, given the incredible talent of this woman, I particularly love this quote. So it's my penultimate slide, which is that in terms of thinking about our own leadership, I think it is important that we have fun in what we do and that we don't take ourselves too seriously. The work that we do is serious, but we need to have the humility as leaders. Final slide, please. And finally, and importantly, whilst you might want to detox, the thing that I'm absolutely going to hold on to is hope. I know for me personally that hope is essential to my leadership. I chose this picture deliberately, daffodils as a symbol of hope. They're a really inexpensive flower, which always remind us, and even when they're poking through the snow on a very cold January or February day, that spring and sunshine are on the way. Thank you. I'd like to hand back to Ruth now.
Thank you, Suzie, for that really inspiring summary of some of the key challenges facing us right now, and some great questions there for all of us to reflect on in terms of our own practices and experiences. And particularly thank you, Suzie, for continuing to deliver that so calmly, despite all the technical difficulties we've been experiencing this afternoon. Apologies to our audience. We have had the gremlins in big time today in our system. They've been in all day causing difficulties in meetings, and they've decided to come this afternoon to this event and give us some difficulties. But I think we managed to get there in the end. So thank you for the team as well for working so hard to fix those difficulties. We are going to move on now for some questions, and we're going to go first of all to Amanda Langsley, who's our guest questioner this afternoon. Amanda is the Associate Director of OD and Learning at NHS Lothian. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a question. So my question for you, Suzie, is I think we could agree that burnout was fairly rife in healthcare before COVID-19.
Yeah.
And how can we best support our leaders to rise to what feels like a monumental challenge of supporting individuals and teams during COVID-19 when their own tanks may well be empty? Where should leaders focus their limited energy to be most impactful?
Thanks, Amanda, and great question. No, you're absolutely right. Burnout is a reality, and as positive and as hopeful as we might feel about the changes we want to make, the reality is that burnout, and we've seen it in all professions. And I like the fact that your question is asking what we can do to help leaders, because I think leaders need to role model the "it's okay not to be okay." I think importantly, leaders need to take time off. I have to say, with my exec colleagues at the King's Fund, we're quite good at kind of nagging each other to make sure we're taking breaks and taking time off and using our leave. I think it's really important that we help people to set boundaries between work and home, and obviously in working in a virtual way for many of us, that's become a bit harder. Prioritising self-care, so talking about self-care, and I would say I've been a leader since I've finished my degree, kind of in the mid-90s, and I'm not sure self-care has ever really been talked about enough, particularly in leadership. So I think us actually voicing that is important, and also kind of how we use friends and family, to reach out to people. But I think most importantly, it's about the culture and the tone that you set at a team level. So being able to talk about how we look out for each other. In terms of where I think leaders should focus their precious time, to take the latter part of your question, I think ultimately the work of leaders is on creating the right culture. So, we've got staff who are capable of amazing things right across health and care. And so we need to tackle some of those things that I was highlighting, particularly around inequalities. We need to create the right environment in which staff can flourish. And if we can practice truly collective leadership, then I think we can distribute that leadership and ensure that everybody on the team is involved. And I think that helps the leaders with the task, but I also think it leads to better outcomes. I hope that's answered your question, but if you want to come back, please feel free.
No, absolutely. That's really, really helpful. Thank you, Suzie.
Thank you, Suzie. And our chat box is buzzing with questions at the moment.
I can see everyone.
There's some fantastic ones here. There really is. So I'm going to start with one that's asking about the transformational change and your views on whether or not it relied on working long hours as well as very flexible working. And if so, is it sustainable?
So I think inevitably some of the transformational change will have relied on people's availability, and we know that people in health and care, because of their intrinsic motivation, will have gone the extra mile and will have worked longer hours. But I think we need to address that long hours culture, and I don't think you have to work long hours in order to achieve change. I think we have many examples up and down the country globally of work that doesn't require that. So clearly the COVID-19 pandemic gave everyone a kind of united cause to be working on, and I think that has also helped. But no, I don't think long hours culture is the right way forward, and I think we've got to find ways of testing and innovating in the way that quality improvement kind of teaches us, so that actually it becomes part of the everyday practice.
Great, thank you, Suzie. And kind of building on that, this is a lovely question. They're all anonymous, so I don't know who asked this, but what assumption of our current operating arrangements would you most like to dispense with? And what new assumption would you replace it with?
Oh my goodness.
Feel free to take a moment to think, because it's a great question.
It's a brilliant question. That is such a I'm going to be thinking about that question for days to come. I think my immediate response, and this may not be the fullest and best of answers, but my immediate response would be around flattening the hierarchy, particularly in the National Health Service. We have a system in which people kind of almost announce who they are by announcing their grade, and so I think the assumption that is within our system of a hierarchy of influence is the thing that I'd like to see go. I think flattening the hierarchy, practicing collective leadership, ideas coming from anyone and everyone, that all teach, all learn approach, rather than looking to the most senior person in the room to be the voice of reason. That's the thing I'd most like to dispense with. I mean, to be honest, I've got complete imposter syndrome coming and talking to all the amazing leaders that will be joining this call today. I'm just one leader of millions. It's kind of, I think how we work with each other to kind of truly listen to each other in order to improve how we care for people is the thing. So that would probably be my main, that's the main thing I'd want to dispense with.
Thank you, Suzie. And I think many of us will be thinking about that question after this.
Great question. There's lots of other things I'd like to change.
So I'm going to give you a bit of a break from challenging questions. This is one for clarification. Somebody's asking, what is teaming?
So teaming is where, and I would refer you to Amy Edmondson's work. She's a professor at Harvard Business School, and you'll see some of her bite-sized work on our website, free for you to watch. Teaming is really where people aren't part of a boundary team. So most people in the NHS are often part of more than one team. And in the pandemic, what we've seen is teams have had to come together at short notice, often for a particular task. So the skills of teaming are very similar to the skills of being in a boundary team, but because you don't have some of the same arrangements. So there's a lot more I think we can learn about how to be an effective team player, team worker, team colleague, whether you're in a fixed team or whether you're working in a more fluid team.
Great, thank you, Suzie. I'd highly recommend that book as well. It's an excellent book, isn't it, by Amy?
It's brilliant. And we've got a couple of short videos on our website that people can watch just to get a flavour of what teaming is. Great
recommendation. Another question here is about what are your ideas about how leaders might be best enabled and supported to incorporate reflective practice as a regular component of their work?
Okay, I'm laughing as I'm answering this question because I have to say I was probably the least reflective leader in terms of actually making time for this until I was fortunate enough to be on the Health Foundation's Generation Q Fellowship, which really gave me the opportunity to see the benefit of reflective leadership practice and to take time out to journal. And to take the time out to really use my learning set. So I'm still part of an action learning set that I joined when I joined that programme, and having those networks and people that you can trust and have trusted conversations with away from the day-to-day of the job, I think is really, really important. So I just don't think I'd given it enough care and attention before. So I think all of us manage others, and I think encouraging people to take the time out to reflect what's happened in a day or in a week. And certainly during the pandemic, in the last couple of months, I use Twitter quite a lot, and you get a lot of good tips from people using Twitter. And a colleague, I think from Northern Ireland, actually was recommending that at the end of the day, you just think about 3 things that have gone well. Think 3 things that have been positive in your working day, and that's really helped me on some days that have felt quite tough in recent weeks.
Great, thank you, Suzie. And as a fellow Generation Qer, I can also recommend the journaling. It would be amazing, wouldn't it, Suzie, if we had protected time in work time to do the journaling? Maybe we should have enforced journaling for leaders.
Maybe we should. I mean, it may be filling people with horror, the idea that when listening to me saying the idea of journaling, but even just writing some bullet points at the end of a week or the end of a day of what's happened. I don't journal that regularly, but when I do, it's really helpful to just make me think about what I'm learning, and also just help me get things into perspective, because it's very easy in the heat of the moment to get things out of perspective.
And just for those who that's a new word, journaling is just simply where it's reflective writing. You just sit and write with some key reflective questions. Very powerful.
Yeah.
So Trevor Anderson is asking, he's highlighting that we have worked across boundaries over this last year to implement change at an astonishing pace.
Yeah.
So you said we've got to know each other better during the pandemic. If and when, hopefully it's when, we get back to the new normal, how can we maintain these new relationships and not get bogged down again in that mire of silo working?
Yeah. That's a really great question, and I think it's something that a lot of people are worried about, and we're also hearing from leaders a sense that actually in some places they feel that things have regressed, they've gone back to how they were. I think as individual leaders and as teams, we need to make a commitment to keep up those relationships, and as we know in our relationships in our personal life, that means you need to nurture them. you need to talk to people, you need to listen to them, you need to you need to pick up the phone. So for me, I think that regular rhythm of how you maintain those relationships, checking in with people, asking how they are, rather than just going straight to the conversation about the work issue that you picked up the phone about. So all the things that we know are good practice around how to develop deep and lasting relationships, I think we need to apply to our work relationships as well. I absolutely understand that finding the time to do that is really difficult. And as someone who spent a long time as an operational manager in the NHS, actually getting to talk to people outside the four walls of the hospital was, quite difficult. So I'm not underestimating the challenge of doing that. But I think if you've started to build those relationships and really kind of the foundations of it during COVID, the last thing we want to do is to lose all that good work.
Indeed. And Suzie, this is one you'll relate to, because I think like myself and many of us, you've been working fully virtually for about the last 8 months.
Yeah, since mid-March.
Be lovely to see some people face to face at some point. But the question here is that do you have any thoughts on the key leadership behaviours for leading virtual teams? Are they the same leadership behaviours as usual, done differently, or do they actually require different leadership behaviours?
Oh, that's a good question too. These are brilliant questions. I think, look, I have to say that I am still learning how to lead virtually, and I would need to have other members of my team on this call with me for them to say how I'm doing, and that's a question that I'm frequently asking them. I think some of the good practice around what we know are people's kind of core needs at work and what it takes to manage people well, I think are still there. The line management, not missing out on people having time with their line manager to reflect, really important. I think there is a danger. One of the things I've seen creep in, both where I work in the King's Fund and talking to leaders in health and care, is because people aren't as visible to you if you're working virtually, there can be a tendency to micromanage, to kind of over manage people, and I think we've got to get much better at trusting people. Look, I think there are other industries that were much more used to doing virtual working before us, so I think there's a lot we can learn from others. And again, if you have a look on our website, and I think the NHS in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have done the same, there are some resources on what it takes, some top tips about how you can develop your practice of leading virtually. In my own experience, I guess I'll go back to the reflection that one of my team members gave just this week, which is that during COVID, my team are out and about quite a lot, obviously working with leaders up and down the country. And so the time for us to actually physically come together was not that frequent. Through using the virtual means, using MS Teams, we've actually got to know each other much better. So I think that as challenging as working virtually is, there are also some advantages.
Great. And Suzie, you mentioned there about the collection of resources, and there is a question about is the King's Fund or other organisations learning from other sectors? So
the answer to that is yes. I mean, I think I've certainly seen that all 4 countries are learning from other sectors. There's always more we could do. So I'm not sure we ever do that learning enough, but I think during COVID we've seen much more of it. Certainly from my own experience of working in England, NHS England and NHS Improvement have put together a professional bodies group. They've been inviting input from others, and that's been a really useful kind of learning network for us to kind of share those experiences and share that learning that comes from other sectors.
Great, thank you, Suzie. So another killer question. I almost feel bad posing this one to you, Suzie, and I
may not be able to answer it. Let's see.
So this is anonymous. Taking time off results in at least twice the amount of work to return to, and quickly exhausting people. What would you suggest to leaders given this reality?
So that is totally the reality, and I can be my own worst enemy at that. I think as leaders we have to get better at saying no sometimes. I mean, I don't know about you, but I take on more than actually I've got hours to do. So I think there is a self-discipline that comes with that, and it's trial and error. You don't always get it right. And I think as leaders and managers of other people, we have to be much more realistic about what's doable in an average shift, in an average day. And we need to cut people a bit of slack. This has been an incredibly difficult year for everybody. And so, you know, so the kind of efficiency or inefficiency has been highly variable. What we can't do is find ourselves in a situation where people don't get proper breaks. And that's certainly when we were doing the work on nursing and midwives during the summer, you know, we were hearing just some of the basics just weren't in place. And, you know, we can't sustain that way of working. We have to make sure that people have proper rest, proper breaks. And so we need to tackle chronic excessive workload in the NHS and in social care. There are no easy answers as to how we do it, but as many people on this call are quality improvers, you know, applying quality improvement, looking at how we can improve what we do, you know, is part of that answer.
And please, everyone on the call, if folk do have ideas, do use the Q&A to put your idea in. You don't just have to put a question. You could share a thought or an idea for colleagues about changes we could test around this really challenging issue. And another anonymous one for you. This is about commissioning. And Space for COVID was partly created by commissioners stepping down under the pressure on the constant target reporting. How might we respond to the inevitable return to this culture, which definitely contributes to burnout?
Okay, challenging question. So commissioning, regulation. I previously worked at Monitor and then NHS Improvement, and we understand the burden that those national and local systems place on providers. I think by inviting the conversation, I think by, you know, creating some reflective space to sit down with those commissioners and talk about the experience of COVID from their perspective and from your perspective, and actually explore together what might be possible in terms of the data that you look at. Now, obviously, a lot of those data requirements are set nationally. So I think there is also something very important for policymakers. And, you know, I work for a policy think tank, and some of the conversations that we're having, particularly in England, both with the Department of Health and Social Care and with NHS England and NHS Improvement, is, yeah, how do you reduce some of that data burden? So I think it's a very real issue. It's not easy to tackle, but I think we'll only do it by actually by creating the space to come together as leaders to work on it together, rather than seeing ourselves as two different factions.
Indeed. And Suzie, a nice positive one now. So how can we be better at noticing and naming the many things that people are doing so well? I love this question.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, because there's amazing stuff happening every day where we work, really amazing stuff. And so our kind of, you know, spotting and saying thank you and noticing those things is, I think, so important. So I think we just have to get into the practice of doing it. We don't need to save it up for people's appraisals. We don't need to save it up for something formal. You know, dropping someone a quick text, preferably picking up the phone to them, you know, noticing something that they've done really well. You know, if they've come out of a difficult meeting, you know, it's so nice when you get feedback of something that someone's seen you do well, which you might not think you've done well at all. So I think we just need to practice that every day. We know what it feels like when someone says thank you to us or gives us positive feedback. So we just need to give it back out.
There is really something, isn't there, about all of us leading by example here and taking this challenge on.
I guess one tip I would have is that something that I learned from the Dartmouth Institute, actually, when we were setting up the Microsystem Coaching Academy, was the importance of a kind of check in and check out of a meeting. So feedback at the end of the meeting, with everyone saying, you know, what they'd valued and what would be even better next time. And that's a really, really nice way of being able to give each other feedback in the team.
Okay, so you actually try and create the mechanisms that are built into our meetings to do that.
Yeah, and it also allows you to say, without it necessarily being harsh, things that could be improved. So it's actually giving you data about, you know, what could be even better next time. So, you know, people need feedback of things that are going well, but also the stuff that you'd like to see less of.
Yeah, what went well and the even better ifs.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We started off with some of this, Suzie, but this question people are still voting on. So I'm going to ask it because I think that there's probably a sense of folk wanting to hear a bit more of your thoughts here. And this is, how do we help create the environment where it's okay to be vulnerable and take care of ourselves?
Yeah. Okay to be vulnerable as leaders, is that the emphasis on the question? And
as individuals, I mean, it's just where it's okay to be vulnerable and take care of ourselves. And they said particularly when services are experiencing significant pressure to deliver care.
Yeah. So yeah, very genuine, challenging question for each and every one of us. And I've certainly faced it, both in terms of when I was managing clinical services, but now in the job that I do at the King's Fund. I think that's where nurturing our working relationships, our kind of our professional friendships, is really important. So having someone that you can go to admit if you're not feeling okay, something isn't going right, and that you're struggling, the ability to do that. And you know, I had an example in my own role earlier in the week where someone was struggling to kind of admit that things weren't going so well from them. So I do appreciate how hard that is. But I think we've all got one or two people that will listen to us, even if we don't feel we could broadcast it to the whole team. So I think finding that friend, that work colleague that you trust to be able to do that. And if you don't feel that you've got that, well, that's really hard, because that psychological safety to feel able to admit what's going on is so important, and that is what leaders need to help create. But if you don't have that, then, you know, speaking to a friend, speaking to a family member. And all organisations usually have some mechanism by which you could kind of speak to someone if you have a particular concern. So I think it's using the channels that are available to us, but most importantly, I think it's having people that you can let off steam to. And I certainly have people in my organisation that I can do that with, but I also maintain a learning set and have other professional friends who I know I could pick up the phone to, I could text now, and who would be there for me. And that's really important, because being a leader can be quite lonely.
Yeah. So have your trusted confidants and use them.
Yeah.
Great. Suzie, people have taken an opportunity to share some thoughts. So Amanda Langsley, who was our guest questioner, is saying, Helen Bevan shared an article recently on Twitter, 6 questions I ask before I say yes to anything. Very helpful.
Great, I shall be looking that up. Thank you, Helen.
Me too. Maria is highlighting that pre-COVID they did a QI project switching off, which was in a frontline safeguarding team to finish work at 5 p.m. by putting in place different strategies.
Right.
And they're now taking that forward. So Maria, I suspect there'd be a lot of interest in, and if you want to share more about that, we would be very happy to share that through the QI, through our website. And Dr. Pritchard is asked the question about taking time off, and is sharing, my own thought is, the more we enable a system to be chronic and excessive, the more it will be so. I believe it starts with myself. How am I with taking space away and encountering an excessive workload upon my return? I think that creating and posing questions for my own reflection is a health practice that opens up space to reflect and be open to receive any insights. So that's actually almost a lovely way to conclude this, summarising that all change starts with I, and it's so easy for us to look to others, but I just love that all change starts with I, and it's for each of us as individuals.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to say again, thank you so much for everything that you're all doing, leading wherever you work. These have been difficult times. 2021 is going to be another unusual year, no doubt, with the changes coming, but I really believe that we can be better.
Thank you, Suzie, and that was an amazing session. Really appreciate both your presentation, but the way you engaged with all of those questions as well. And you've given us so much food for thought. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks. Take care, everybody.
So I'm delighted to announce, and if we could have the next slide, please, that our speakers in January are the authors of the best-selling book Compassionomics. So it's Stephen Trzeciak and Anthony Massarelli. So their research demonstrates the power of compassion in healthcare. So if you want to hear how 40 seconds of compassion can save a life, do join us in January for what promises to be another insightful and thought-provoking session. Next slide, please. And of course, just to remind you, the rest of our back catalogue is available for you to watch and enjoy on our website, or you can visit the QI Connect YouTube channel. So finally, thank you all for joining, and hopefully we'll see you all in January for Compassionomics. Goodbye all.